God our Father and our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Today I want to talk a little bit about Psalm 1, which you read earlier in the service. Specifically, I want to talk about the final verse, which says, "For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, the way of the wicked will perish." Now, there are two things that stick out to me about this verse. First, that it seems to be only loosely related to the rest of the psalm. So I have to work to figure out what it's doing here at the very end of it. And second, the two halves of the verse aren't completely balanced. Here's what I mean. It'd be smoother if the poet had said something like, "The way of the righteous will survive, but the way of the ungodly will perish." There we have a nice contrast. Or, "Yahweh will preserve the way of the righteous, but will destroy the way of the wicked." If the poet had done that, the parting of the ways would have been much cleaner. The difference between the two would have been much clearer. But the poet denies us that satisfying ending. The verbs "to know" and "will perish" don't provide that nice contrast. So the more that I think about the line, the more I wonder, what does the line, "the Lord knows the way of the righteous," actually mean? What are the implications of the Lord knowing the way of the righteous in contrast to the perishing of the wicked? My mind has to work overtime to try and figure out the meaning of this line just at the point where I'm ready to stop thinking about it. So what do I make of this last line? Well, I think the line has its own pleasures to offer, and that's what I hope to share with you today. Now, in order to do that, the first thing I have to do is energize those words, "the Lord knows." Because the verb "to know" packs a lot more power in the Scriptures than it tends to in English. Remember, in the Bible, to know doesn't refer only to a cognitive activity. For example, when Genesis tells us that Adam knew his wife Eve, everyone here knows that I don't mean that Adam went digging through her Facebook page for information about her. You know that I'm not referring to him being able to tell you what her favorite color was, or how many children she wanted to have, or what kind of shampoo to buy when he ran to the store. No, as the first two perfect human beings on earth, given the instruction to be fruitful and multiply, Adam's knowing was undoubtedly quite active. But when the Lord tells Israel, "You only have I known of all families on the earth," or when he tells Jeremiah, "Before I created you in the womb, I knew you," he's not simply saying that he knew some information about them. He's saying that he's chosen them. He's appointed them. He actively cares for them. To know in these contexts is a dynamic and super active word. So I think we should see that word that way in the psalm as well. For the Lord knows. That is, he anoints. He cares for the way of the righteous. So when you read the line that way, rather than being an enigma, it's actually the revealing moment in the psalm, and the answer to some questions that the psalm raises as you read through it. For example, given that we human beings, all of us, are addicted to sin, I wonder what keeps the righteous from falling into the lifestyle of those ungodly sinners and scorners. You see, the answer of the psalm is that the Lord cares about the way of the righteous. He keeps them from falling away. How blessed are they in the lives they are able to lead. Right, Scripture shows us that no one naturally delights in God's instruction. We much prefer to do our own thing. So how do the righteous manage to love it? How do the righteous become rooted in it so that they bear fruit? How do they get to that point where, as the psalmist says, they prosper in all that they do? The answer of the psalm is that the Lord cares for the way of the righteous. He is the one who plants them by springs of water in the first place. He is the one who gives them His word that takes root and nourishes them. He is the one who helps them prosper in all they do. Okay? That makes sense. I'm pretty sure most of us can accept the poet's point of view without much problem. It may not even occur to you that most of what he says doesn't appear to be true at all. But you see, for a lot of people, when they read this psalm, from their perspective, the poet is painfully naive. He simply seems to ignore reality. They point out that in our day-to-day experience, things don't really play out with this obvious contrast between the righteous and the wicked, the way the poet seems to assume. In other words, in this world, good, God-fearing people are not necessarily more prosperous, more happy, or more blessed than the ungodly. Nor, on the other hand, are the ungodly necessarily saddled with all kinds of hardship and suffering in contrast to the righteous. In fact, in this world, it is quite often the opposite. In this life, you can't tell the trees from the chaff simply by their outward circumstances. Because good people suffer and evil people prosper all the time. This was something so obvious to the prophet Habakkuk that he accused God of perverting justice rather than promoting it. Job saw the same thing. He experienced it in his own life to the point where he cursed the day of his birth. The preacher in Ecclesiastes looked at all the injustices of the world, came to the conclusion that everything is meaningless. To them, God seems not to know or care about the way of the righteous, whoever they are. He doesn't care about them any more than he seems to know or care about the way of the wicked, whoever they are. Chance and circumstance, good and bad, they happen to us all in seemingly very arbitrary ways. Now, I assume that the prophet, or that the poet, is not simply naive. He knows, he realizes all the injustice that is in the world and in our own lives. So I think that this psalm reflects the convictions that the poet holds, even when the world provides no support for those convictions. For him, the truth of everything he says about the way of the righteous in contrast to the way of the wicked depends on what he says in that last line. Not on what he sees with his own eyes or by his experiences in his own life. The stability and the prosperity of the righteous is a conviction to be believed. Just like the instability of the wicked might not be apparent right now, it is nevertheless a conviction to be believed. The poet believes that despite outward appearances, the wicked will not ultimately prevail. They will not ultimately stand in the congregation of the righteous because the Lord knows the ways of the righteous. Again, that's good enough as far as it goes, but still we have to wonder, what does that psalm finally mean for me? Well, the poet believes that there are these distinctions between righteous and the wicked which will one day become apparent. In his world, those categories are simply a given. But the psalm doesn't tell us which one we are. Right? Wheat and tares are thrown together until the harvest, remember. So here's the dilemma. If you can't simply look at how people fare in this world and then reason backwards in order to determine where they stand with God, if appearances are deceiving, if justice is topsy-turvy, then how do you know where you really stand? You might think that you're part of the righteous. God might just regard you as one of the sinners, the self-deluded, doomed chaff. And you will never know until it's too late. See, that's the question that the final verse of the psalm leaves us to wrestle with. Does God care about me or not? Am I one of the righteous or not? And that's a really important question to think about. In fact, after the psalm, it becomes a life and death question. Especially in those moments of life where you are extremely conscious of your own sin. Those moments where you look at yourself and your sin and go, I sure don't feel very righteous. So which way ultimately is your life going to turn? Now, to answer that question, I have to step in for a bit and remind you that this is actually why I am here today. Everything else that I've been talking about the last few minutes is really a prelude to this. Because above everything else, I'm here to tell you that you are part of the righteous crowd. Every one of you miserable sinners is righteous. And every one of you guilty souls can be absolutely certain of that, because God has made it so. We're here today, like we are every Sunday, as part of the continuing celebration of Jesus' resurrection. And think about what his resurrection tells us. You see, Jesus, the righteous branch, perished on the cross. It was justice at its most topsy-turvy, justice at its most twisted. But then God raised this righteous one. And it's in his resurrection that the Lord, the righteous one himself, shows us the ultimate destination of the way of the righteous. The Lord knows the way of the righteous because he blazed the trail and he did it for you. He was crucified for our offenses, Paul says. And he was raised again. Why? For our justification. See, there's righteousness for us in that word. Paul writes, for as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. It's done. It's finished. There is nothing more that you can do or need to do. In Jesus, God forgives you for everything. By grace, he declares you righteous. In Jesus, God knows you. In Jesus, he has chosen you. In Jesus, he cares for you. So one last thing. As I said, this last verse undergirds everything else that is said in this psalm, but it's also a point of reference for all the other voices that will speak in the psalms that follow. That means that this line can be a point of reference for you and for everything else that happens in your life. See, other voices in the Psalms deliver to us dilemmas that the righteous face along the way. Perplexities and mysteries that are not easily resolved, and because of which they cry out in lamentation to God for deliverance. And at those times, God hears their prayers, and they turn to praise and joy and rejoicing for what God has done. Lament and praise. That is what the Psalms give us. But no matter what, these voices never lose faith in the rightness of their path. And they remind us to never lose faith along the way as well. Our way is certain. It's certain because it's not ours. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, and he will bring us safely to the destination that he has promised. Amen. May the peace of God